And now we will turn to questions from the committee members, and we'll begin by recognizing the gentleman from California, Mr. McNerney.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank the panel for coming here today, and I find your testimony good and interesting. In your testimony, Mr. Holliday, you mentioned that the DuPont reduced greenhouse gas emissions while reducing cost. Am I correct on that?
Yes. We reduced 72% greenhouse gas emissions over the period of time we described. And we did it by letting the resources go to the very best projects. So every project we authorized at least to earn 12% return, which was good for our shareholders. And so that's what we think is so key about the cap and trade approach, that if it allows the resources to go to the best projects so people can trade and develop those, we think it makes a big difference.
Thank you. Was there a net job gain or net job loss, or was it neutral?
For the United States, there's a net job gain from that.
Thank you. Ms. McDonald, I'm going to ask you a similar question. You said that Alcoa reduced the GHG emissions by 36%. Was there an increase in cost or a decrease in cost for operations as a result of that program?
We've actually, it was as a result of some major changes in reducing our process emissions, and that has resulted in not only decreased costs, but has increased our efficiency greatly.
Well, thank you. That brings me to my point, is that the thing that excites me about this bill is that I think that if we do it correctly, we can get to the point where we pay less for energy and have better results and create a lot of green jobs in the process. I'd like to ask the other panel members that I haven't asked yet if they agree with that optimism. Do you think we can reduce energy costs and have better quality of life and create jobs at the same time? Yes, starting with Mr. Cavanagh.
Yes, I believe on the front end, one of the things that's particularly important about looking at a framework as U.S. CAP has pulled together, it has a number of linked elements that help reduce the higher costs and the more volatility that we're likely to see in the earlier years. But as time goes on, as my colleague had mentioned, what you will find is you will find over time the efficiencies will get better and better and better, and then therefore there's less need and less volatility in the system, and you will end up, I think, having made that transition in the most effective way.
Yes, thank you. Mr. Rogers?
I think over time you're going to see the price of electricity rise. I think that is inevitable, and that's why it's critical that we get the regulatory models correct so that there are adequate investments in energy efficiency so that we're able to give consumers control over their use of electricity, and over time they can reduce their bills by reducing their usage levels through productivity gains. But it's inevitable that the price of electricity is going to rise over the coming decades, and that comes off a decade and a half where the real price of electricity has actually fallen.
Well, that's going to happen. Electricity prices are going to rise anyway, but I believe we can get ahead of that cost curve with efficiency gains, and that's the point that I'm trying to make.
I think I don't want to mislead you. I think the price of electricity is going to rise in every event. It will rise with compliance with carbon legislation, but the way we address that is with productivity gains in its use. Because what I envision is not only do we retire and replace existing plants with new plants, that will drive prices up, but as we go from an analog grid to a smart grid, that will drive prices up. In 30 states where they've adopted renewable portfolio standards, that will drive prices up. And over time, you're going to see prices continue to rise. The big question is, can we incent energy efficiency investments to control usage and get productivity gains?
Thank you. Mrs. Bernanke?
Yeah, I'd just like to emphasize that there are tremendous opportunities in energy efficiency. In California, you've had great experience. Even though the cost may be higher per kilowatt hour, the usage is less because of the very great mandate for energy efficiency there. So energy efficiency is the cheapest, fastest way to get real reductions in carbon emissions, and that will decrease the direct cost of the consumer. So the quicker that we can unleash that opportunity, the better it'll be for the consumers across the country. And there's just huge opportunities in the building sector, in the appliance sector, in commercial buildings, in homes, et cetera. So there is a huge opportunity there.
Thank you. Mr. Crane, you've got about 6 seconds, but they'll give you another 30 maybe.
Thank you, Chairman. Congressman, to me, the answer to your question depends on what your view of future fossil fuel prices. You know, our company's view is that they're more likely to be like they were last June than they are right now. And if you think about that, I think that going to no carbon technology, and you think about where the money for fossil fuels goes, that there's no doubt in my mind that the American public will be more prosperous with the adoption of the type of technologies that will be incented by this legislation.
Thank you.
Great. Gentleman's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Barton.
Mr. Chairman, are there members on that side that haven't asked any questions yet?
That's why we're recognizing them first.
Well, have we recognized all of them?
No, we have not.
Then let's recognize them.
Well, thank you.
And then
we appreciate that. That's very generous. Thank you. We'll recognize next the gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Sarbanes.
I appreciate it very much, and I appreciate that courtesy as well.
Just give me a vote when we go to markup.
There's no free lunches anymore in America, are there?
We give you credit, but you can't use it for anything.
Okay. Such are the allowances in this committee, right? Thanks for your testimony. I want to come back a little bit to the discussion you just had about the extent to which the expectations about consumer efficiency affect the models or the projections. And obviously, my view of the auction question, in other words, how much free distribution there should be, at what levels and for how long, versus auctioning these allowances, as well as my view of what percentage of the proceeds ought to be coming back to the ratepayers, is significantly affected by my confidence or lack of confidence in the ability of the consumer to with some kind of rapidity put these efficiencies in place. And I assume the models that you've done are, I mean, they're putting some kind of assumption in place as to how quickly you can move with respect to the consumer's efficiencies. But it's very elusive, and there's a kind of leap of faith element to many different aspects of this issue. I was curious what the incentives are that you're thinking of offering to your ratepayers beyond to become more efficient themselves, to take ownership of this, beyond simply their desire to escape the added burden that's going to come from increased electricity costs, as you indicate. I mean, what kind of partnerships are you going to enter into? What sort of programs will there be? And anybody can answer that.
I think what is going on in virtually every state that we operate in, there's a total rethink of the regulatory model. In California, they adopted decoupling, but quite frankly, that leaves companies just economically indifferent, and not much gets achieved through economic indifference. What will fundamentally change investment in energy efficiency will be a model that incents companies to invest in reducing megawatts in the same way we're incented to meet the growing demand with building a megawatt. So we have proposed in each of the states we operate in a save-a-watt approach, which basically compensates us in the same way for reducing megawatts. So what you can see is that we will take hundreds of millions and billions of dollars over time, once the regulatory model is in place, to actually invest in our customers, to help them have productivity gains in their use of electricity. And I believe what will come, if we look back 5 to 10 years from now, what we call energy efficiency today will be very primitive compared to what will be done over the next decade. And I believe that will be driven at the state level. That will be driven by changing the regulatory models.
So your investment could be seen as another way of giving the consumer kind of a rebate or a reward for being more efficient, and it kind of feeds on itself.
Well, I actually think that technology is really the key here. I have come to believe, and having been a CEO for 20 years in this industry and watched energy efficiency come and go, that putting a list of 15 things on the refrigerator for a family to do to reduce their usage is not going to get the job done. Yes, there'll be 10% of the people or 15% of the people that would do that, but the ability to deploy technologies where you're writing softwares for the home, software for businesses, so that you're using technology to match up to the comfort and convenience criteria of the customer, and that automatically happens, so it's back of mind. In the same way, when somebody walks into the room and throws a switch, the lights come on. Nobody asks, is that a nuclear? Is that coal? Is that wind? We hope that the technology will evolve and the software will be written so that it automatically occurs and those energy efficiency gains occur in the home by the way it's been programmed.
Okay, my time's up. I just wanted, Mr. Chairman, note for the record, this morning I was at the U.S. Coast Guard Yard in Baltimore, which today became the largest U.S. Coast Guard facility, well, actually the only U.S. Coast Guard facility in the world that is now going to be powered 100% by renewable energy. It's a landfill. They're capturing methane, piping it under the highway, and bringing it into the Coast Guard Yard, and it's a real model for the federal government in partnership with private enterprise to take the lead. Thank you.
We thank the gentleman very much, and we now turn and recognize the gentleman from Vermont, Mr. Welsh.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Chairman Waxman. Thank the panel members for your leadership on this. As we have been having discussions and getting questions from both sides of the aisle, a major concern is the economy and what the impact is of taking action. And I'd say there's two schools of thought here. One is that if we take action, it actually will threaten jobs, and I think many of the people who take that position, it's not just political; it's a legitimate concern. The other, and I think this is embodied by the bill that Mr. Waxman and Mr. Markey have presented to us for discussion, embraces the confidence that we can actually create jobs, and it's the better way for our economy. I'll start. I want to get your comments on that and how we address some of these concerns that people are making about jobs, because we can either get stalled or answer the legitimate concerns that are raised. And I'll start, Mr. Holliday, how about with you? I mean, you've heard all the concerns and probably you've had those discussions within your own company.
Exactly, and that's why we think in our blueprint, the way we've talked about phasing things in, taking into account how the allowances are allocated,
right?
So we don't have a sudden shock to the system is very important.
Right.
What I see from our company is in solar systems, biofuels, energy efficient systems for homes, there's so many opportunities. If we had the market here, right, we would develop the manufacturing and new jobs here. So I think it's a very complex situation. I don't want to say it's simple, but I think it's very possible.
Well, your company's affected. I mean, if we get it wrong, then employment could be adversely affected in your company, and obviously you've got a responsibility to maintain your bottom line for your shareholders. So you've come to this conclusion that it's better to act.
Absolutely, without question.
All right. And Mr. Rogers, how about you? Same thing. I mean, you're in an industry where traditionally the more you produce and sell, the better your bottom line, and you're talking about a new way of doing business.
But we believe now's the time to act. First, we're going to get more bang out of the buck that's spent in that part of the stimulus. It's the green stimulus, if we have a price on carbon, right, and a roadmap going forward. So we think that gives us a chance to amplify on the dollars that have been spent. Secondly, I believe it's not shovel-ready jobs that we will produce. We're going to produce real 21st century jobs. As you start to look at deployment of renewables, you look at deployment of carbon capture and sequestration. In Indiana, we're building a coal gasification facility, and that will be the cleanest coal plant, but it also will become a site where we can do carbon capture and sequestration and start to scale it. So in my judgment, there will be a lot of jobs developed tied to having a price on carbon and having a clear vision with respect to the roadmap forward.
Thank you. Ms. McDonald, how about Alcoa? They've considered this, obviously.
Yes, we have, and we think that the long-term certainty that this legislation can provide is really important in providing that sort of confidence over the long term, because we believe that this is an issue that really requires action and requires U.S. leadership, and that we believe that the sort of technology that will be unleashed, if we get the framework right, will be able to provide a basis for us to invest and for the new lightweight technology cars, for instance, to be a market for our own product.
Okay. I want to get your opinion on a thought that came to me as I was listening to the concerns raised by folks who were worried about us taking action. It's about jobs, and people have their points of view that this will help or will hinder, and I share the view you've expressed that it will help. But would there be any problem, as people on the panel see it, if we put into the bill some mechanism by which we could actually do a assessment every 6 months or so about what the impact was of renewable electricity standards, or what the impact was of the cap and trade, so that we're answering the question specifically as we go along and building into the legislation some capacity to make adjustments that in the implementation of anything complicated will require adjustments. I'll start, Mr. Crane, with you.
Well, no, I don't know exactly about the 6 months things, but I think the U.S. CAP blueprint talks specifically about cost control mechanisms to make sure that you're moderating the system as it goes along and looking at the impact.
Okay. Dr. Beinecke?
I think it's a good idea. I think that there's been a lot of studies done by different organizations looking at what the job potential is. There's certainly a lot of belief that the jobs are there. I think documenting it and then calibrating possibly areas that need incentives and those that don't is a good thing to do.
Thank you. I think my time is up. I'll yield back. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Mr. Welch. Mr. Blunt?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I don't want to unnecessarily repeat anything that's already been done here, but I do have some questions. I know Mr. Rogers, in his submitted testimony, raised the issue about the renewable electricity standards that were included and had concerns about those. Do anybody else share the concerns about the renewable standards? Mr. Rogers, you talk to me just a little bit more about that, how you think those standards could better serve the purpose of the bill here.
My judgment is a cap and trade. Once you let the market work, the market will select the right technologies, and the price on carbon will allow that to happen. In a sense, I view a renewable portfolio standard. We already have 30 states with renewable portfolio standards, so we're on the way to that happening. And what you'll note is that every one of them is different because every state is different in terms of the availability of renewables. The other point I would make is, in a sense, a renewable portfolio standard, the way it's designed, is picking technologies when those technologies are already got significant tax stimulus that are investment tax credits, bonus. We're well aware of that as a wind producer, the availability of those incentives. So I think, in a sense, having a cap and trade system and a renewable portfolio standard, in a sense, is belt and suspenders and a picking of technology that's not needed under a robust cap and trade system.
Do you have? Should nuclear be one of the available renewables?
Well, if the goal line is a low carbon future, you would expand and transform the renewable portfolio standard into a low carbon standard. But now we're on the road to command and control, and it raises a fundamental question about whether you really need a market approach cap and trade if all of a sudden you're moving to a 60% renewable low carbon portfolio standard because you're picking the technologies rather than let the market pick it.
Now, do you think it would be practical at all for the states to determine in their state what their standard, what their renewable standard should be for their state? Is that a workable, I thought I almost heard you suggest that was a workable alternative.
I think it is a workable alternative, and that's why 30 states have stepped up and done it. But you'll notice in many of the states what they've done is they've included energy efficiency as a component. The other thing they've done is they have a provision that provides an economic out, because people on the state level are concerned because they're closer to the consumer. They're concerned about the price impact of a renewable portfolio standard, particularly if the prices are extremely high and will drive the price of electricity up in a sharp and unyielding way for consumers.
Thank you. Mr. Holliday, do you have any, or anybody else can address this as well, so you can all listen, and if anybody wants to chime in, you can. Do you have any sense as we move into a world where we're less competitive because of our utility rates, that the so-called the two huge nations, India and China, would not try to move in and take advantage of that option? And is there any evidence that they've ever held back to not compete in a way that takes advantage of their new situation?
Oh, I think we ought to see China and India as serious competitors to the country. And that's why I believe this action that we're talking about today is the right step. If we can become leaders in more efficient energy, because the overall equation is how efficient is our energy, what's the cost of our energy versus the cost in China versus the cost in India. And so we've got to take the steps to make sure that's the case. Very much they're our competitors.
And is the time frame that we're getting there the right time frame, in your opinion?
I think we need to lay out the game plan, and I think so the industries will know what the opportunities are. My judgment is the science, the technology will come along faster than we currently think once we know exactly where the goal line is.
So how long do you think it would take us to get to the point that we were a lower cost energy producer? The transition here is actually what bothers me the most. It's not the goal, it's getting there at a time that doesn't create a competitive disadvantage for us.
We're working on solar technology now. Solar is only 15% efficient. 50% of the solar cells are made in China. They're my customers. I make the raw materials here for those solar cells. So if we could put in the right systems, I don't see why we couldn't move that solar cell manufacturing here very fast and start making a difference with only a 15 to a 30% efficiency. I couldn't give you the exact timeline on how long that'll take, but it'll be over a decade.
But how does cap and trade make us more utility efficient?
If cap and trade does, as Jim Rogers described, lets the resources move to the most efficient system, which is what's critical about it. That's what we've done inside our company, and but it will take time. This is not a 1 or 2 year fix.
But aren't you adding cost to the system while during that process of moving toward the more efficient system? I guess that's the timeline that I'm most concerned about. And Mr. Rogers, I'm going to let you answer this too, because you obviously have an answer here. But go ahead, Mr. Holloway.
Yes. I think there will be some increase in costs in the system, just as Jim described. I think it's critical that as you enact this legislation, that it have the right safeguards, that if China and India don't ultimately follow, we've got some ways to make adjustments.
And is your opinion, are any of those safeguards in the legislation now as you've looked at it?
Well, what we've proposed in our blueprint from U.S. CAP, there is. I haven't studied the detailed legislation enough to be able to answer that.
Mr. Rogers.
Congressman, I think that you have really focused on one of the key issues, and that's this. We've got to get the transition right. And that is to smooth out the costing impact on consumers over a long enough period. And we've got to match up the transition period to our technology roadmap and the availability of technologies at prices that make sense. And I think we can do that. And I would say one other thing, and this really goes to the earlier question. I believe now is a time to address carbon legislation when the economy is in a recessionary period, because we'll be more focused on the economics of this than the theology of it. And what I mean by that is this. We can address climate, we can put a price on carbon. We can put a cap on emissions and let it decline over time. The key is to get the transition right, and that's a longer discussion about allocation of allowances.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Blunt. We have several members who should be recognized next because they didn't get a chance to ask questions of the next panel, but I would ask their permission, since I have to leave for another appointment, to be able to say some questions, say some points and ask some questions first.
Since you're the chairman.
Okay. Without objection, I'm grateful to my colleagues for this opportunity. Let me just say I've been involved in environmental battles for all the time I've been in Congress, and I've never seen anything like U.S. CAP and this panel that's making this presentation today. So often what we've seen is one side environmentalists, and the other side the industry, and then they fight it out. What you've done is come together over a two and a half year period and discuss these issues and try to figure out some way to accomplish the environmental goals, the economic goals, and the low carbon future that we're going to need. So I want to thank you very much for the work you've done. But just to, Mr. Rogers, just to follow up on some of the points that just came out in your question, in your answers to Mr. Blunt's question, when Secretary Chu was asked, why do we need a renewable portfolio? Why don't we just have the cap and trade get us to where we want to go? His response was that it would take a while for cap and trade to get us to some of these points. It would be quite a while down the road, and that he thought a renewable portfolio, which doesn't specify whether it's solar or wind, but specifies among different renewables, that would get us some reductions right away. Do you disagree with that?
I listened carefully to Secretary Chu's answer this morning that you suggested, and my point of view kind of rolls out like this. One is if you look at the study by EPA, you see a significant increase, and we've seen a significant increase in wind already. And that a lot of that is driven by and I say that as someone who's in the wind business, by the tax incentives that exist today, and with the new incentives, we're driven even more to invest. Mm-hmm. I think the key point from my standpoint is you've got 30 states with renewable portfolio standards. An approach would be to say every state should have a renewable portfolio state, but leave it up to the states to determine what makes the most sense for them. And an approach, a way forward with that would be have a date certain for the states to design one, because quite frankly, not one size fits all. And the fact that you have 30 very different renewable portfolio standards today reflects the differences that exist in the different geographies and the different sensitivities around the country. And so we can achieve what Secretary Chu is talking about by having every state have a renewable portfolio standard, but let each of them design their own.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's an interesting concept. Would you also allocate some help to the ratepayers in all those states where there is a renewable portfolio standard driving up the costs?
What do you mean by help?
Well, if under the U.S. cap proposal, the utility would be able to lower the rates for the ratepayer as a result of the increase in costs from a cap and trade. Here we'd be talking about an increase in costs as a result of the renewable portfolio. Do you think that the ratepayers ought to get some assistance from the money generated from the cap and trade system?
It would be my judgment, and maybe I'm just a purist, but to the extent you have a cap and trade system, mm-hmm. I would, and you did the allocation of allowances, I would tie it to the cap and trade system.
To the cap and trade.
And I wouldn't try to add or subtract from it, because it puts us on a slippery slope to, well, if you're going to do it for that, why not for this, or why not for the next thing? Mm-hmm. Or, as we've seen, some people have suggested using these revenues for purposes far beyond solving our climate challenge. And so I'm a purist when it comes to
Well, I would
how
object to that, but this is related to solving our climate problems. Dr. Meineke, what are your thoughts on this issue, on both of the issues of whether we have a renewable
I think that
portfolio.
one of the things that we've seen, particularly in the renewable area, is that the uncertainty with sort of stop and start annual tax credits. And one of the things that Secretary Chu said, and I think is really important, is long-term consistent signals so to allow investors to really make a commitment in the sector of renewables. And I think a renewable electricity standard actually does that because it provides a long-term consistent signal to the investor to allow major investment in that area and increase the percentage that renewables provide. So there's a real, we've seen just over the last year sort of stops and starts and uncertainty in investments. And if we're really thinking about unleashing clean energy over the long term, a signal for that long-term consistency, I think, is important, and I think a renewable electricity standard does that.
Well, I see my time is about to expire, but we've heard repeatedly today concerns that passing legislation like the discussion draft would cripple the economy, yet you represent the core of our economy, manufacturing and utilities and energy. So you're giving us the exact opposite message. You're saying that our economy and your company's success depends on the passage of our legislation. Is that the conclusion I'm to draw? And I guess that could be a yes or no answer.
I think if you get the transition right, I think the answer is yes.
Okay, thanks. Mr. Holliday?
Yes.
Mr. Cavanagh? Mr. Cavanagh, do you want to, for the record?
Transition, yes.
Okay, thanks. Ms. McDonald and Mr. Crane.
The transition is the key. That's why we're here. But it's certainly, as well, it's critical that we have legislation which provides long-term certainty.
Thank you.
I agree with my colleagues. Yes on the transition.
Thank you. Mr. Sullivan, you didn't get a chance to ask questions, so I'm going to recognize you next.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My question's for Mr. Cavanagh. How are you doing? The Waxman-Markey discussion draft would include petroleum refiners within the definition of covered entities in the cap-and-trade provision of this bill. Recognizing that the legislation is currently silent on the choice between allocation and auction, can you please provide your thoughts on this issue?
We are covered, and we are also unique in our classification. We're covered for both our own greenhouse gas emissions that our refineries and other facilities make, but we are also, if you will, the point of regulation for the end users of our products that we manufacture for all of their greenhouse gas emissions. So we really exist in two buckets like no one else does. One of the challenges that we have is that unlike LDCs and others, we don't have any legal mechanism where we can pass along costs or talk among colleagues. That's basically prohibited by law. There are a number of studies that have been out in the public that would indicate that if we got zero allocations, that would assume we're able to pass along 100% of our costs, and that's just not the case. There's only two conditions where you can assume you might be able to pass along all of your costs. One is if you have absolutely perfectly inelastic demand, and the other is if you have totally elastic supply. The U.S. refining industry has neither of those. So what we are trying to do is working with the staff, trying to update some studies, because any former studies really don't reflect the world we're going to be in. And we believe that we will come up with some situation that we'd like to present that will show there's some merit to considering us in an allowance allocation system as a result of our uniqueness.
Okay. And one other question, Mr. Cavanagh. Retention of good-paying American jobs is at the forefront of policymakers' minds as we debate this bill. The Waxman-Markey discussion draft contains a provision that would supply additional credits known as rebates to energy-intensive industries that produce products that are heavily traded in the international commerce. However, it is unclear whether petroleum refining would qualify for these rebates in the discussion draft. Your thoughts on this?
We're the second most energy-intensive industry in America. We employ really good-paying jobs, and it's not quite clear to us whether we're qualified under that. But certainly we would think we should be, because as a result, right now, there's about 6.5 million barrels of oil refining capacity that's being built outside our borders, much of which is being targeted to come into this country. So if we don't have some similar protections and some guidelines, we're concerned about leakage and ultimately increasing imports at the expense of our domestic production.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Gaffney.
Mr. Braley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I apologize for my voice, but I want to share the chairman's enthusiasm for seeing such a diverse group of people here today talking about such an important issue to the future of our economy, our national security, and our country. And I was very pleased, Ms. McDonald, to see Alcoa's presence with the U.S. CAP. They have a huge production facility in Bettendorf, Iowa, which I'm very proud of. I'm proud of the jobs they create and the incredible contribution they make to our national defense. But I'm also very proud that companies like John Deere, which has a huge presence in my district, saw fit to exercise a leadership role in this important topic. And I think nothing brings that home more than the fact that the reason I was late getting here is I was meeting with representatives of IBM in the city of Dubuque, which is the oldest city in Iowa and is in my district. And IBM and Dubuque are embarking on an important new partnership that grew out of IBM's decision to locate a global delivery facility in Dubuque, creating 1,300 jobs. And because Dubuque has been at the forefront of some innovative leadership in a small to medium-sized city and sustainability, it was a perfect combination of forward thinking by corporate America and a progressive community that want to completely change the way they look at their energy footprint. And as part of this partnership, IBM is delivering assistance in 3 core areas: green infrastructure by providing diagnostics, instruments, management, and optimizing infrastructure; sustainable operations by streamlining businesses for processing of energy, water, and carbon; and intelligent systems to provide actionable information in near real time, creating benchmarks and metrics that can be able to demonstrate how these projects are going to improve the quality of life of the citizens of Dubuque. So what I would like the panel to do is start by sharing some of the vision that each of your companies embarked upon to lead you to this table today and why this bill is so important to the future of corporate America. Mr. Crane?
Wow. I thought such a far-reaching question I'd maybe get to go at the end, but I mean, our vision starts from the fact that we recognize that we're a major emitter of carbon and that was not sustainable in the future, and we expect to be around for a long time, so that we needed to get there, but to us, again, being the capitalists and believing in free market solutions, the opportunity here to sort of change the society that we live in and to create for us what is essentially a low-growth industry, the electric industry the way it is now. This is a high-growth opportunity for us, and particularly when you look at the electric car, which for our industry is really the air conditioner of the 21st century in terms of electricity demand. You know, we can be the solution not only for our sector but for the transportation sector. And so that's what brought us to this place in time.
Ms. McDonald?
We've had a similar journey because we recognize that by its very nature of its primary production, it's a very energy-intensive process. But we have found that we could successfully reduce our own process emissions, particularly in our smelting business, and also engage in a lot of energy efficiency projects. And we saw that this is something on which we must act, and that there were ways of doing so which would be beneficial. And like Mr. Crane, we can see that moving to a world where there is increased emphasis on recycling, saving energy, using more recycled aluminum is really very important to us, and it's an opportunity for us to reduce our energy demand, but also to lower the resource use overall. And so we can see growth in using recycled aluminum, using more aluminum in transport to save lightweight vehicles and save energy, to use more aluminum in buildings, not only because it's recyclable, but also because it can actually help create some more highly energy efficient buildings. And so we see the opportunity for setting up a long-term framework, a market that will actually reward those sorts of energy efficiency and lower resource uses. And so we can see that that is going to be good for our company long-term and help us restructure into that world and keep locations like Bettendorf healthy and growing.
Okay. Dr. Peinecke.
We've had a great opportunity to work with these companies, and it's not only the major companies in U.S.
You can use microphone.
Not only the companies in U.S. CAP, but there's so many clean tech companies around the country who come into our offices every day with new ideas, new inventions, new technologies, see a huge opportunity to unleash. And what they want to know are, what are the rules? What's the system that we can do this under? And there's just a clamor out there right now.
Mr. Rogers.
In the 20th century, it was our company and our industry's mission to provide universal access to electricity. The reason we joined U.S. CAP is because we believe in the 21st century our mission will be fundamentally different. One will be to decarbonize our supply. Two would be to help our communities be more energy efficient. And thirdly, we believe that this translates into energy security. And just as two statistics, 40% of the emissions today of CO2 comes from the power sector, 30% comes from the transport sector. I could envision a world where you've decarbonized the generation fleets in this country. With plug-in hybrids and electric vehicles, we will have weaned ourselves from foreign oil, and we would have the energy security and independence that we've all dreamed about, and I believe our industry can play a role in making that happen. This is a first step on that journey.
Gentleman's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Barton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Crane and Mr. Rogers, the current draft has a renewable portfolio standard for electricity generation that does not include nuclear power. It doesn't include new hydro, I believe, or old hydro, and it doesn't include clean coal. Would you gentlemen support a clean energy standard that included those energy sources?
I would, yes.
Okay. Mr. Rogers?
It would be my judgment with a cap and trade system, you don't need a renewable portfolio standard or a clean technology standard, but if you're going to embrace and pick wind and solar as a winner because they're low carbon, you should include nuclear as part of the low carbon standard.
So your preference, Mr. Rogers, is to have no renewable standard at all?
My preference is to leave it to the states to make judgments about whether they need a renewable portfolio standard in their state.
Okay. Dr. Beneke, do you have a position on that?
Yes, I should just say that U.S. CAP actually doesn't have a position on the renewable electricity standard, so we're all speaking individually on this point. But we actually support the renewable electricity standard for the reason that I said earlier, which is predictability of investment, long-term.
But would you expand the definition to include some other things?
I like the definition that's in the bill now. That's the definition.
So you don't want to include nuclear, and you wouldn't include clean coal?
I wouldn't.
Okay.
No, I wouldn't.
That's fair. Now, here's the $64 question. All you gentlemen and ladies that support this cap and trade system, do you support it if they keep the current draft and that there are no free allowances? It is a pure auction system? Mr. Crane?
We would, if it was 100% auction from the first year, no, we would not.
All right. Ms. McDonald?
Likewise, no, we would not support.
Dr. Beneke?
We support what I talked about earlier, which is in U.S. CAP we designed an allocation system which is free allowances going to an auction.
Total auction like they currently have, or you think there should be allowances? I don't need a lecture on.
No, I'm just saying that we designed a model, and that's what we support, the model in U.S. CAP.
So you do not support the current draft because it doesn't have any free allowances?
My understanding was that the current draft hadn't really defined how the allowances would get allocated, and that was one of the topics for discussion, which is why we were proposing the U.S. CAP process.
I guess that's fair. That's fair. Mr. Rogers?
I would oppose any legislation that had 100% auction.
Okay, Mr. Cavaney
Oppose 100% auction.
and Mr. Holliday.
Oppose 100% auction.
All right, now let's go. How many of you are CEOs or at least decision makers in your companies? I know Mr. Crane is, Mr. Holliday is, I think Mr. Rogers is. How many allowances does DuPont need, Mr. Holliday, either in tons or in millions or billions of dollars?
I don't have a specific number, but they are not nearly as critical to us as there would be some other companies in the equation.
Okay. Mr. Rogers.
As I started my testimony, because of the fact that we are regulated in the 5 states we operate in, I'm really speaking on behalf of my customers. And I would say any cap-and-trade system that allocates allowances would start with a base period, and I would be looking at 100% allowance allocation year 1.
Okay, that's fair. Total free allowance is for year 1. Mr. Crane.
You know, we operate in competitive power generation markets like Texas. The price of
We love that you're in Texas,
Yes.
and that Mr. Rogers company. I'm all for you guys being in Texas.
You know, the U.S. cap approach this is based on net compliance costs. So we produce, as an overall company in the U.S., 64 million tons of carbon a year. We don't need carbon allowances to cover all that because the price of electricity will rise to cover part of that. But the European system, which, as you know,
doesn't work.
Yeah, led to some windfalls. We can learn from that and do it in such a way so there are no windfalls. And all we are seeking in the early years is to cover our net compliance costs and then to ratchet down on a transitional basis.
Okay, well, that's my time's about to expire, Mr. Chairman. But there's the dichotomy. To go back to what Mr. Holliday said and some of his, you cannot have a system that puts a price on carbon and doesn't raise cost. If you have these free allowances, whether it's for a little bit of time or all the time, then you don't get any benefit because you don't price it and you don't bring the usage down. Now, there is another way to do it, and that's to use the Clean Air Act model where you set a regulatory compliance. You actually set a performance-based standard, do away with cap and trade, and there will be a Republican alternative that puts that on the table here in the very near future, Mr. Chairman. With that, I yield back.
The gentleman's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Arkansas, Mr. Ross.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank all of you for coming today. Well, I believe there are some good things in this bill. There's others that cause me to pause and give me concern, and hopefully some of you in these panels can help me with some of that. I want to speak first about the shorter the answer, the more questions I can ask. But I value your opinion, and I want to hear it. Renewable electricity standard. If the whole point to this bill is to get carbon neutral, then should it really matter where the energy comes from? And therefore, do we need a renewable electricity standard? To any of you, don't be shy.
It would be my.
I think that there's a real opportunity to unleash new technologies. As Dr. Chu, Secretary Chu mentioned earlier, even with the cap's not going to get going until after 2012, and we need to unleash technologies now. We need to figure out how to incentivize them. That's one way to do it, and certainly we need more renewables to get to a clean energy economy. So that's a design to do it. There may be other mechanisms too, but unleashing that renewable opportunity, I think, is key.
I would suggest, Congressman, that with the tax incentives we have, that's going to stimulate investment in renewables. With the fact that 30 states have renewable portfolio standards and other states are looking at it, that's going to unleash investment in these technologies. And in a sense, we don't need a national standard for a variety of reasons that I have discussed and is included in my testimony.
Let me ask you this. You know, I believe that in states where renewable works, we should be doing it. Unfortunately, I come from a state that's not a wind state. Our options for renewable electricity are limited, which means they'd largely have to be imported at a higher cost to our consumers. let me ask you, as it relates to the renewable electricity standard, what do you think that means for those of us in the Southeast, those of us in states like Arkansas where we're not wind states? Would it mean higher electric bills for our working families and our seniors, or how would we go about trying to meet such a standard? I mean, there's a reason why the states that do not have one don't have one as it relates to a renewable electricity standard. So, you know, if you were a working family, a senior in Arkansas where we're not a wind state, what would this mean if this standard is passed? What would it mean, do you believe, for them?
Congressman, I recently spoke at the Clinton School, and this issue came up there in the questions, and gave me a chance to kind of think about it and respond to it. And my judgment is that if you look at the 30 renewable portfolio standards we have today, they're all different because every state has different resources. And clearly our company does business in the Carolinas, in Kentucky, in Ohio, in Indiana, and every state is different in terms of the ability to produce wind or the availability of solar. All you have to look at is a wind map of the United States or a solar map to see the uneven distribution of those resources. The short answer to your question is, for us that are not blessed with wind or the right solar concentration, it's going to mean higher prices without the ability to invest in the technology within the state.
Anyone else? I guess my concerns, we're not a wind state, and I think, you know, where we have wind, we should use it. Where we have solar, we should use it. I think we need to use more coal, but we need to clean it up and hold the companies' feet to the fire to invest in the new technologies as they become available. We need to do more nuclear if we're serious about global warming. There's very few cleaner options. Natural gas, we need to do it all, and everything we can move from the science lab to the marketplace, I think we should. Let me, anyone on this panel want to speak to how biomass is defined in this? And a lot of us believe if the definition was expanded, that would help us some, but we still think we would have a difficult time getting to the required percent in the time allowed. Has anyone know anything about biomass and how we might be able to expand the definition of that to help states like Arkansas that simply don't have enough wind? No? Wrong panel. Finally, let me just ask this. You know, I know there's going to be some exemptions early on for steel, but I noticed they're not for refineries. And yet we're too dependent on other countries for our energy. Should there be some type of exemption on the front end for refineries, just as we have for steel today?
Yes, sir. The refineries are the second most energy-intensive industry within the country. We now currently import 10% of our crude oil to use in our refineries. There is about 6.5 million barrels of world-class refinery construction underway, a good measure of it targeted for the United States. And if we don't protect those 150-odd refineries we have here and the good jobs that they have, we're going to experience both loss of our own production capability here. We're going to significantly increase our imports, and we'll have some leakage of jobs elsewhere as people try and figure out how to compete. So we'd like to work with the committee to take a look at how we might be treated. We are unique. We're the only covered entity who is both on their own emissions as well as consumer emissions.
Thank you, Mr. Cavaney, and we want to work with you and with the gentleman from Arkansas. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Hall.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I guess I'd ask all the witnesses this. You know, most of us on this side and most of the people I deal with and hear from are convinced that we're going to have a very weakened competitive position in the United States under cap and trade. And I think you all recognize that, and you probably observed it from the questions from this side and maybe from folks that you've talked to on the streets that think we're going to really be affected by it. I'd like to ask each one of you, what evidence does U.S. cap have that China and other developing nations would not take strategic advantage of what's going to be a weakened competitive position in the United States under cap and trade. You may not agree with us. Do you all disagree with when I say I think we're going to have a weakened competitive position in the United States under cap and trade? Is anybody that disagrees with that?
Chad Holliday with DuPont.
Yes,
we must have provisions in the bill you're preparing to take into account if China and India and other key countries don't follow in a significant way that keeps us competitive to make adjustments. But I think just the opposite is true. If we start first, we have a much better lead than letting them start first. So I think in the long run, it will help us cap and trade be more competitive.
But however we start, and if it goes in the direction it's going now, do you see any way in the world that it can't present us with a very weakened competitive position under cap and trade?
Absolutely. I think it will mean we will be the leaders in developing the new technology.
We'll be paying, too, out of our...
Absolutely, yeah, and that's what creates the incentive to create the new technologies. But I think there's real opportunity for us, but there will be dislocations in doing that. We must take that into account for the retraining of people for the new jobs.
You know, for any of you that's ever been in Sears or Walmart or anywhere, when you bought something, you noticed a piece of equipment there between you and the door that you had to go by, and it's called a cash register, and you have to pay for what you get. And the United States is going to have to do that, and it's just one way to do that I know of, and that's in continued and increased taxes on a generation not even born yet. If we carry out the program that this bill sets in motion. So if you don't agree that we're in a weakened competitive position, just to assume that we're going to be in a weakened competitive position. Give me some evidence that you might have that U.S. cap has that China and other developing nations wouldn't take strategic advantage of it.
Well, Congressman, I think, again, we think safeguards should be put against that, but I would also say there's an opportunity cost here in that if there is very strong evidence right now that China as an industrial entity and as an exporter is moving right now to take the lead in electric car, to take the lead in gasification, to take the lead in nuclear power. These are all areas that are partially driven by concern about carbon. So in a sense, by moving forward, you know, from where we sit, this gives us as a country an opportunity to lead in these.
You mean you think we have a good opportunity under cap and trade? Think the United States does, as this bill proposes?
I absolutely think that a well-thought-out cap-and-trade system will create incentives for innovation that this country is still the best at, that can lead to the development of great export opportunities for...
You think China's going by the cash register?
Congressman, if I may.
Sure, yes.
I would suggest to you that if we design this bill right, we get the transition right, it will not weaken our economy. It will put us in a position to be stronger over time. And I say that as someone who about 50% of the customers that I serve make less than $40,000 a year. And they're in those Walmarts, and they're in Target, and they're looking for low prices, and they're concerned about increases, and their disposable income in the states that I serve are lower than the national average per capita. So when I wouldn't be sitting here today if I thought a cap-and-trade bill would hurt them. One that's poorly designed could hurt them. One that's poorly designed could weaken our country vis-a-vis China or other evolving countries. But the reality is we need to get the design right. If we get it right, it will make us stronger.
But haven't you testified or someone testified that your customers' rates would go up under the cap and trade as you see it in this bill?
It's my judgment that our rates are going to go up anyway as a consequence of aging infrastructure and the need to reinvest in it as a consequence of certain other factors.
Great. Gentleman's time has expired. Chair recognizes the gentleman.
Mr. Chairman, may I just ask unanimous consent to put an article by the Washington Post on China hopes climate deal omits exports. I ask unanimous consent to put this in the record.
A unanimous consent request has been made by Mr. Hall in an unprecedented gesture by Mr. Hall, to ask an article from the Washington Post be put in the record. And without objection, I want us all to be eyewitnesses to this historical moment. So without objection, so ordered.
If you're going to accept it, I may just withdraw it. Here you go.
Thank you. It will be included in the record. The gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Space, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'd like to thank the panel members for being here today and your testimony today, but more so for your efforts with regards to U.S. CAP. I think it really represents a huge step forward in approaching these very challenging issues. I'm convinced that there may be no more difficult issue for this Congress to deal with this term of all those compelling issues out there than climate change, and would agree that something must be done. I think you all agree with that. I'm not sure everyone on the committee does, but most of us recognize the need to do that. But a lot of us are concerned about the effects it's going to have, clearly. I just heard some testimony about the international marketplace and how this may affect our ability to compete internationally, and I agree with Mr. Rogers when he says if it's done right, it may enhance our ability to compete internationally. My question, however, relates to domestic marketplace issues, and specifically, I think most of us who come from Middle America, from coal-producing states, from heavy manufacturing states, have some concerns about the regional discrepancies and inequities that this may occasion, whether it's, as Mr. Ross from Arkansas says, a state that has limited options in producing renewable energy, or whether it's states that rely inordinately upon intensive energy manufacturing processes, or whether it's states that have an overdependence upon coal for the production of their power. I have some real concerns about the effect, the regional effect that this legislation may have. I think we can address those. What I'd be curious to know from you, and Mr. Rogers, if you want to start it, and anyone is free to jump in, did U.S. CAP take that into consideration in the formulation of its recommendations? And does this bill account for those concerns if it did? And what are some of the specific things in the bill that are geared toward addressing some of those discrepancies and inequitable manifestations of the legislation?
Well, one of the things that U.S. CAP blueprint is embodied in the blueprint is a focus on making the transition and the allocation of allowances to help make the transition. And we spent a lot of time talking about that and recognize the linkage between cost containment and the transition so that it doesn't hurt our economy during the transition. And we each can speak to that. But I think what's missing in the bill today is really, and is not addressed, is the whole transition issue. How's that done? I mean, President Obama's talked about 100% auctions, appears to have pivoted off that a little. There's allocation of allowance approach, and there are many approaches. So I think the important thing that needs to get done is have a robust conversation about the impact. In your state, 86% of the electricity in Ohio comes from coal. It will be one of the most directly impacted of all the states in the country with respect to an auction system, for instance, 100% auction.
Let me stop you, Jim, because I have a limited amount, only one more minute, and there was one issue I wanted to talk about, and that is carbon capture and sequestration. The money that's devoted to CCS in the bill itself, it's my hope will help offset some of those regional discrepancies that occur. Is that sufficient in your mind to help take care of some of those regional discrepancies?
I think it's great to have money invested in carbon capture and sequestration, and over time it will make a difference in terms of developing the technology. But the short answer is what's going to solve the impact on different regions is how you allocate the allowances, and that needs to be addressed. that is the key to getting it right.
You've got 30 seconds. Does anyone else want to weigh in?
We just agree.
All right, thank you. I yield back my time.
Great. Gentleman's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Pitts.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Holliday, you said there could be dislocations, or there would be dislocations as a result of cap and trade. What industry groups might suffer dislocation? I assume you mean job losses.
I think that the opportunities is what I was focusing on, and I believe that's for solar. I believe that's for bio-produced fuels that can come from switchgrass and corn stover, products from this country that we're not using productively today. And what we'll need to do is take people out of that are not employed or need retraining and to be trained for these industries. And so I think a companion piece of this legislation should be the training to help people move into the new industries that will be growing.
Well, how climate legislation treats the manufacturing sector is a critical issue that's sometimes overlooked. One specific concern of mine is how legislation avoids unintended consequences in the manufacturing sector. We can't pass a bill that creates huge disincentives against future growth in manufacturing. How would you propose to guard against a rapid rise in energy costs for the manufacturing sector?
First, I agree with you completely that that's very critical. And one thing we must watch very closely is natural gas, because it's a key feedstock to so many manufacturing plants in your states and across the country. And we've got to find a way that the existing U.S. industry is not totally disadvantaged versus some places in the Middle East. And we need to take that into account in the bill.
I think it's well accepted that a cap and trade program would make our energy cost and production cost rise relative to those countries without similarly stringent emissions control system, namely China and India. There would be leakage. We had testimony in a hearing earlier. There'd be leakage of emissions and jobs to less rigorous regimes. What would your recommendations be for reducing this leakage? Anybody? Mr. Crane, you want to start?
Well, I think we sound a bit like a broken record on that, but I think getting the transition right, we have a very adaptable economy with very adaptable companies in it, and avoiding a shock to the system. And that's why we think that the committee should be very much focused on the transition period. And then we think the consequences that you're referring to would not happen in a significant extent.
One of our companies is in Indiana. And Indiana, we're the largest utility in Indiana, and Indiana is one of the larger steel producing industries, and Nucor is one of our largest customers. And if prices went up there dramatically, and they could if the transition isn't done right, that could lead to a shutting down of plants and the loss of jobs. So I come back and say, we've got to get the transition right, or it could have a devastating impact on our economy. And the whole sport is around the transition and protecting our economy.
Well, if we pass the bill as drafted, do you foresee an increase in gasoline and electricity prices? Mr. Rogers?
I think without seeing what I described in my testimony as the elephant in the room, no conversation around how the transition is going to work, I think I can't answer that without seeing what that transition looks like. But I do believe over time electric prices are going to rise in every event, whether there's carbon legislation or not. And I believe a renewable portfolio standard will add to pricing. I think going to a smart grid will add to prices of electricity. And I think over time, carbon legislation will lead to increase in prices. I think that is inevitable. And as I said a few moments ago, it's not going to be cheap. And we just need to face up to that and find a way to mitigate the impact during the transition and find a way to create new technologies and new jobs along the way.
Dr. Bernanke, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, I think that just to follow up to what Jim said, in U.S. CAP we actually dealt with the issues of the transition, and that's why we made the proposal that we did for how the allocations of the allowances could take place. I mean, the issue of going to gas or disruption regionally, additional increased energy costs, we address those directly, and the blueprint actually is designed to provide a blueprint, in fact, to address how that transition could take place. I think that in many respects, looking back at the document gives our best thinking on how to have that transition occur most smoothly.
And did you come up with a price cost to remove a ton of CO2 in the study?
We didn't come up with a price, but we came up with both how the allowances could be allocated and then what a cost containment mechanisms would be with offsets and other mechanisms that are designed to do that, and included a major investment in efficiency to lower the cost of the consumer. So it's sort of, all these things were linked, and I guess that's another important aspect is the linkage.
Thank you. My time's up.
Great. Gentleman's time has expired. Just for the record, it's Dr. Bernanke for the banking crisis, and it's Dr. Beinecke for the climate and energy crisis.
Thank you for that clarification.
Two different doctors for two different problems. The chair will recognize himself. We are waiting, by the way, for two roll calls to be called imminently on the House floor, at which point we will end the questioning for this panel. We will then break for those roll calls, and then we will move on to the next panel. So the chair will then just, I'm going to ask each one of you, if you could quite briefly, just give us a brief response to the foundation principle of U.S. CAP, which is that action is needed now. Could you give your brief individual perceptions of what the consequences are for failing to act now, in your opinion, over the next generation? We'll begin with you, Mr. Crane. Could you move in the microphone, please? Yeah. And turn on the microphone as well. Thank you.
We are sitting on $1.5 billion that we want to invest in low and no carbon technologies, and we're making our assets tend to be 50 to 60-year assets, and so we need certainty. And so we can start on this problem right now, but we need what the guidelines are like in the Waxman-Markey bill.
Okay, thank you. Ms. McDonald.
Like Mr. Crane, our business is a long-term business, and we certainly believe that this is an issue which is a global issue. We're experiencing a lot of movement and regulatory movement in Europe and elsewhere around the world, and so we believe that it's important for the United States to act as well, and we're looking for the certainty that that would provide for our own long-term investments, as well as the market stimulus that it would have for a lot of our products.
Great, thank you. Dr. Beinecke.
We're part of U.S. CAP because we think that the science on global warming is powerful and overwhelming, and we need action soon. We recognize that a solution that works for the environment has to work for the economy too, and that business has to be part of it, which is why we were willing to sit at the table with these companies and many more to try to work out our differences and come up with a proposal that we think can move us aggressively to reduce carbon emissions and address the economic issues that have been raised today in this hearing.
Great. Mr. Rogers.
Mr. Chairman, I adopt all the statements that have been made to date, and it would add to it by saying by starting now, it will translate into a lower cost of compliance over time and a better ability to smooth out the cost impact on consumers.
Mr. Cavaney.
Mr. Chairman, we are energy providers to the consumer, and we need investment certainty because the energy business is very long time lead times and long investment cycles. We think a national approach gives us an opportunity to provide products without the variability of many states. We think that's important, and we feel that at the end of the day, the competitiveness that we'll have globally, having gone through this period and adopting a program like is outlined in the blueprint, makes great sense.
Good. And Mr. Holliday.
2 points. If we don't act, China will take the lead from us in the technology, and that's serious. Second, I lead a group of scientists, and they remind me every day this science is real and we need to act now.
Okay, thank you. And Mr. Rogers and Mr. Crane, very briefly, what additional partnerships beyond U.S. CAP do you think your industries will have to reach with the automotive industry, with the building industry, with energy efficiency industries in order to put together partnerships to solve the problem? Mr. Crane.
Well, I think that where the electric industry's come up a little short is working on the transportation sector, because again, you know, we're focused on solving our own problem with it, which is important. But the fact that we can solve the transportation industry's problem is a big opportunity for us, and I'd like to see our industry do more in that area.
Okay, great, Mr. Rogers.
I would say that in U.S. CAP, many of those industries are represented and have been part of this discussion. And I would say that we are investing with respect to the auto industry. And our own company has invested significantly to be ready so that our grid will be ready when the plug-in hybrid is available.
And what does that future portend from your perspective, Mr. Rogers, in terms of the viability of the plug-in hybrid future for our country?
I believe, first, we need to transform our grid from an analog grid to a smart grid. We're on the way to doing that. And secondly, I believe that produces an opportunity with the plug-in hybrid, and I think it's sooner rather than later, because the amount of work that's going into this is remarkable across the country. And as I talk to many auto companies, they are at work with respect to this. And so I believe it is in the future, and it will give us a greater utilization of our fleet and will lower cost over time on a per unit basis.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Rogers. And Mr. Cavaney, we'll give you the final word.
I think one of the key things is to establish a price of carbon. Then that'll work across industries. That allows people to have metrics that are common, even though you have to cooperate rather than produce the same products. And I think that the efforts that are underway here now are the beginning of trying to identify what that is, and commend you on it.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Cavaney, very much. Chair's time has expired. We now turn and recognize the gentleman from Michigan, the ranking member on the subcommittee, Mr. Upton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As I indicated earlier today, I'm most concerned about jobs and the job loss, particularly with a tax cap and trade bill. And Mr. Cavaney, you talked a little bit about the costs, multi-billion-dollar compliance costs that that you all will be able to suffer under. And, you know, I know that I think Aruba's got the largest refinery in the world, Venezuela, other places around the world. Something tells me that Aruba is never going to be underneath this legislation. We may try our best to get India and China, but something tells me that Aruba is not going to have the off-ramp to proceed. What's going to happen? Can you give some type of commitment as you look to produce gasoline for America? If you have additional costs in the multi-billions to comply with this, what is the rest of the industry going to do in terms of domestic refinery production here?
Well, that's one of the things that we worked on together with our colleagues in U.S. CAP was to create these complementary measures that address situations like this. Again, ours is an energy-intensive industry. We're going to be susceptible to those threats of increased imports if we're too disadvantaged. But there are the allowance allocations, there are the opportunities of treatment.
But at some point they come due. You might have a year or two off, but I mean, at some point they're gonna come back and hit you.
But our other point is if we get the certainty for investment here, we produce world-class materials in our industry for creating new opportunities. And we're investing very heavily, not only just in oil and gas. So we think that given frameworks similar to this, that come through the system, and giving that powerful signal is going to be our best effort to compete against, much as Chad Holloway has said, against foreign nations, which are not standing still.
Ms. McDonald, same question for you. You all produce, Alcoa produces primary new aluminum and recycled aluminum in a pretty good quantity, I think, in this country. Is that right?
Indeed.
What, as you came from Australia, what is going to happen to Alcoa as it relates to the percentages now versus other countries where you might have sizable operations? Isn't there going to be a magnet that take those jobs someplace else if we impose these new cost burdens on?
I think our experience is very similar to what has just been described. The producers of aluminum in Russia, in China, now are large because they have their own markets. And what we're seeing is the fact that these there's going to be a global regime impacting greenhouse gas emissions. Each country is going to be regulating it differently, but we think for the United States to start to move now to provide that sort of long-term certainty and to provide the sort of transition and cost containment that we proposed as part of the US CAP blueprint would be the required conditions for us to get ahead of that game and to reduce the costs over the long term. And that's why
I'm running out of time. Thank you. Mr. Rogers, you confessed that you're the third largest emitter. What percentage of electricity now do you produce that would be considered renewable under sort of an Upton Rogers definition of renewable, i.e., you need to turn on the mic.
We're producing about 500 megawatts of wind.
But as a percentage, what would
it's a
that
very
be?
small percentage. I think nationally, wind represents about 1%
Right.
of the total.
So are you below 1% wind now?
We are. But if you look at our nuclear, about 96% of our electricity comes from coal and nuclear, 70% from coal, and the remainder from nuclear.
As you know, I am one that supports using nuclear, which is greenhouse gas emission free, to be counted as a renewable. Let the market work to that end. But let's say we're not able to get that provision in. We're going to try, but let's say we're not able to get that in. We have the definition that passed as the Platts-Udall or the Udall-Platts amendment in the last Congress. What steps, how much will it cost you, Duke Energy, to meet a 25% standard by 2025?
I don't have that number at my fingertips, but I will send it to you and submit it for the record.
Will it be sizable?
It will.
And
because in the states,
last question that I have 4 seconds left. I had breakfast this morning with the chairman of DTE. 1 in 3 customers in that region of Michigan are in arrears in their bills. Hundreds of millions of dollars will be uncollected. It is the same with other utilities around the country, more than 20%. What is the percentage today for Duke Energy that's uncollectible this year?
It is much lower than that, but it varies from state to state. But I'll be delighted to submit that number to you also.
Thank you.
Great. Gentleman's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Green.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate the opportunity for the hearing. Mr. Cavaney, I know a lot of these questions may have been asked by different members in the whole panel, but it's kind of like Congress. We say it's not said unless all of us say it, so we may have some duplication. I know the U.S. CAP blueprint for legislative action called for the fuel-related GHG performance standards, and does the low-carbon fuel standard as written into the draft align with the U.S. CAP blueprint for legislative action that's called for? If not, how is it different?
No, sir. The blueprint suggests that we not have an overlay of a low-carbon fuel standard on top of a renewable fuels standard, and there's very good reason why. The discussion draft has, in essence, what I'd call a donut hole in there. There's a period of time where from 2014 to 2022, in which we're to produce a low-carbon fuel with decreasing amounts. But during that entire period, we're not permitted to include all the renewable fuels that we've already incorporated and will be incorporating into our renewable fuel standard. Also, there's a reach back to 2005, which does not give us permission to have a baseline any more forward. We in North America and in parts of South America rely on heavier fuels, which makes it much, much harder without the use of renewables and other things to reduce our standards. So we're going to have a very real problem trying to satisfy the consumer during that period. So we'd suggest a closer look at the blueprint and trying to harmonize that so we end up with one fuel.
Well, I would hope that our committee would keep that difference in mind when we go forward, because it does create a problem in the later years because of the duplication, maybe go back to the U.S. cap. The retention of good-paying American jobs is the forefront of, I think, all of us today, in particular, and have heard the question from my colleague from Michigan for Alcoa. I used to have an Alcoa plant in Houston, Texas, and it had a number of employees who were constituents. The Waxman-Markey discussion draft contains a provision that would supply additional credits known as rebates to energy-intensive industries that produce products that are heavily traded in international commerce. What are your thoughts regarding whether refineries should be eligible for that, for those rebates? Or do you think refineries ought to be included with chemicals and aluminum and other products?
My view is you should take a look at each of those, look at their exposure, and find out whether or not you think that there's somebody who's going to have leakage during the process. And as I say, we think, looking at our industry, that we'd like to work with the committee to try and be able to gain that opportunity.
Okay. Mr. Crane, again, welcome. And like Congressman Barton, I have both ConocoPhillips has a huge chemical plant in our district, and NRG and Duke are obviously parts of our Houston community. Mr. Crane, you support the idea of transitional partial allocations to emitters like NRG. In your testimony, you said that it's necessary to give enough runway to get some lift under the wings for low-carbon investment in the power sector to really reduce its carbon intensity. How long do you think that runway should be, and should the allocations phase out or shift to full auction for emitters in the power sector?
Well, Congressman, you want the runway not to be so short that it's punitive, so we can't adapt, but not so long that you inadvertently incent us to build a whole generation of plants like we've done in the past. So, again, 60-year assets. I think the end of the runway needs to be in the 2030 to 2035, because when we do, financial modeling for 6-year assets, how much money they may be making or not making 20 to 25 years in the future is actually quite important. So I think that's where the end of the runway. The other bit of it's the beginning of the runway. And again, I think the committee needs to be focused on where the country's going to get its next generation of baseload power. Okay. And that, to me, is clean coal or nuclear. And I think this country, with the best pragmatic efforts, is going to build 5 clean coal plants and 5 nuclear plants by 2020. So you have to be careful about how quickly you start down the ratcheting down.
So you would think there should be a nuclear option in this bill for some type of section in it. But let me, before I run out in the last 13 seconds, NRG has substantial investments in cogeneration facilities. And having the area I have, typically all of my plants have a cogen facility next to it. The cogeneration enhances efficiencies and allows industrial power to really play a double effort, fueling production and producing energy. That's part of an energy efficiency effort. And being part of U.S. CAP, was that discussed when including some of the efficiencies in, particularly from cogeneration facilities?
I don't recall specific conversations about cogen within the U.S. CAP, but I mean, cogen obviously is an exceedingly efficient form of energy. So, I think it's something that should be supported as a matter of public policy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate the time and again, the responses, because energy efficiency should include cogeneration in some of our plants so we can do it. Thank you.
Thank the gentleman. And did you exclude natural gas from the future baseload for some reason, Mr. Crane?
I think natural gas plays a role in future baseload, but we saw what happens when the country depends exclusively on natural gas for baseload. It leads to a price spike that's not good for the economy either.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Crane. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Stearns.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My question is for Mr. Rogers and Cavaney. It turned out in Europe, the granting of free allowances led to these huge windfall profits by the utilities. I guess the question is, isn't the U.S. cap just a sort of a grand bargain to get the business support in exactly the same way? I mean, that's what it looks like to us on this side anyway. You might comment on that, Mr. Rogers, and then you, Mr. Cavaney.
Two important points. First of all, what happened in Europe was a consequence of not following what we did with the cap and trade system for sulfur dioxide. One, they didn't have base years, so they couldn't allocate it on base years. And secondly, they had a short-term experimental period that created some gaming in the process, and they had a fundamentally different regulatory regime for power companies. They had deregulated entirely the industry there. So you have a different fact circumstance here in the U.S. today.
Okay, I appreciate that.
But here's a second important point, and that's this. Under our proposal, all the allowances go directly to local distribution companies or the local utility, which are regulated by the state, and there are no windfalls to utilities or corporations with respect to the granting of allowances under our proposal. That's one of the great myths that is floated around that is just wrong.
Okay, and Mr. Cavaney?
Yes, it's called free allocation, and there's a misnomer there. Really, the intent is that this allowance that's made is to cover the unrecoverable costs of implementation here. So ultimately, the beneficiary of this is a softening of the volatility and increased prices that the consumer may experience about that. And there's an opportunity to look at these things, and we're not going to be repeating, as Mr. Rogers says, the kind of incidences that occurred in Europe.
Dr. Bernanke, we went on your website, and your website states, quote, new nuclear power plants are unlikely to provide a significant fraction of future U.S. needs for low-carbon energy. NRDC favors more practical, economical, environmentally sustainable approaches to reducing the United States and global carbon emissions. Now, here is a power source that emits zero carbon dioxide. Why is this not a solution to reduce carbon emissions?
Well,
based upon what your website says, I mean, it seems to me that you should be at least neutral on this. But
I'd say we are generally neutral because we don't oppose the existing 20% that's already provided by nuclear power. What we're really saying there is that we think there's tremendous opportunity in efficiency, first and foremost, in renewables, in new technologies that need to be unleashed. That nuclear power is a mature power source in this country that has been with us for decades, and it will continue to be. But what we're looking at is what do we need to unleash in the future to really reduce carbon emissions? And those are new technologies new investments that haven't been experienced yet.
But nuclear has zero carbon dioxide and no carbon emissions, and you want to reduce carbon emissions.
What I said is that I wouldn't reduce the 20% that's there, but that what we're looking for, particularly from NRDC's point of view, is what are the new things that we have to bring online? And the bill is really designed to unleash the area of energy efficiency in appliances, in homes, in buildings, which is both incredibly cost-effective, actually earns money rather than costs money. So what we're focusing on is what we think the solutions are going forward that are not yet on the table. And we think, nuclear's on the table. It'll continue to be on the table, and it'll be a part of the solution. But we don't have to be the advocate for it.
You think there should be a title in this bill for nuclear? Right now, there's
I don't think it's necessary. I think there was a title in the 2005 energy bill, the 2007 energy bill. I don't think that all of the subsidies and programs that were developed in those two bills have actually been fully implemented yet. So do we need another one right now? I would say no.
This is, in fact, based upon we already have something that's practical, technologically efficient, and you don't think that we should have any encouragement for nuclear. I understand.
That isn't what I said. I'm sorry, sir. What I was suggesting is that there was a lot of encouragement in the last two energy bills, and that I don't think that it's necessary at this time in this bill.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Right. Gentleman's time has expired. Chair recognizes the gentlelady from California, Ms. Harman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have been sitting here for a few hours. I know you have too, and so have the witnesses. But I want to say that the testimony of this panel, as far as I'm concerned, is the central testimony that we need. And their ongoing advice is exactly, for me, the roadmap forward for this committee. For a couple of reasons. Number one, most of you on the corporate side are in the business of producing materials and fuels that are going to be regulated under whatever we do. You know exactly, precisely what the impact of this regulation will be on you. And I have listened carefully, and all of you are saying that you want certainty so that you can plan forward. And I've also heard you say, or at least I heard Mr. Rogers say, and I applaud it, that at a time of economic downturn, which we are in, no one would quarrel with that, we can do this better because we're more focused on the economics than the theology. Does anyone want to quibble with anything I just said? No. Good. So my next idea, Mr. Chairman, is instead of going to the vote, we ought to lock the doors and get our members here and sit down with these folks and with the kids in the green T-shirts for our inspiration and finish this. What do you think, Mr. Chairman?
We will be here late tonight, so we might have to. I don't think we're going to have a problem. We'll after
all right.
The final votes of the day.
Right,
we have every member's attention for the next 5 hours.
I have been, I think none of you has missed it, carrying this prop around with me and holding it up at all occasions. It's at the top of my little folder of materials, and I have had a chance today to read it more carefully than I had. And I would observe that it is a much more detailed blueprint than some who have been asking questions might know. It's not a bill, but it surely has at least what I would use if I were a thoughtful legislator, which I hope I am, to craft a bill. And guess what? The draft bill that we have has been based on these principles. Everybody agree with that? Good. Let me finally say, because maybe there are a few more members who want to ask questions before we have to go, that I have made another point, which is that the composition of U.S. CAP is bipartisan. I don't want to ask anyone your party affiliation, but I do want to ask the group, is that statement of mine correct? Are some of the members of U.S. CAP, the leaders of these organizations, Republicans and some of them Democrats? Is that true?
Yes, that's very true.
That's very true. Well, good. So let me just finally
good.
Finally say that, Mr. Chairman, I think we should regularly call on these people and the other 20 members of U.S. CAP who have participated in this work product. And I really want to commend you again for using this consensus document as the basis for the legislation. I think we're going to end up somewhere right about here, and we're going to do some very good work this year and provide the certainty that industry needs. I yield back.
We are going to follow the gentlelady's advice and the U.S. CAP as well. To the gentleman from Illinois, Louisiana, and Connecticut, here's where we are. Gentlemen from Louisiana and Connecticut have yet to ask questions. There's about 12 minutes left to go. If the gentleman from Illinois would agree to this, I would like to divide the time in 4-minute segments between the three of you, if that would be acceptable, and then we can adjourn with this panel being dismissed. Would you mind?
I think I can deal with that, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, thank you. Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you. Let me, the devil's in the details, and with respect to my colleague from California, who's we all have great respect for, there is a gaping hole in this bill, which is the credits, which is the allocations. And what we fear is a stimulus-type proposal that gets dumped for markup the 11 o'clock the night before a 10 o'clock markup, in which you all don't know whether you'll be incentivized or harmed, and it'll get rammed through. Would you not agree that airing out the allocation issue in a transparent process in a hearing just like this would be helpful, Mr. Crane?
Well, the allocation auction issue, I think, took up the most of the U.S. CAP's time, or the 2.5 years. So I agree. We all agree. I think that's a very...
Well, let's ask everyone. Ms. McDonald.
We certainly support the whole approach that is contained in the blueprint, which is the allocation process.
But I'm talking about, don't you think we as a nation would be better if we had these credits here that we could have a hearing on over a period of days to discuss this allocation process? How long did it take you all to do it?
We've certainly said that we want to work with the committee on that basis, yes.
Well, the question is, would we not be better to have a hearing on the credits and the allocations so that you would know and the public would know what is in the details of this bill? Yes or no?
It's not up to us, I guess, to do.
It is up to you. You're testifying. The question is to you as an individual. Would it not be beneficial to your company to know the details in a transparent process in a hearing on a bill? Yes or no? You don't want to know?
We certainly want to know. And
so would it be helpful to have a hearing on the credit allocations on a global climate change bill? Yes or no?
We'd certainly participate in a process.
Why don't you say yes or no? Yes or no?
If we were invited to a hearing, we would certainly, for that.
Would it be helpful to your shareholders to know the cost of doing business prior to us voting on a bill?
Yes, we'd certainly.
And could we not have that if we had the allocations published?
We'd certainly want it published, yes.
Yes, thank you. Doctor?
If there was a hearing, we'd love to come and discuss it just as we have today with the allocation.
And that would be helpful in us clearing up a lot of this issue, since there is a gapping hole, a glaring hole in this bill about who's paying for what.
I think a transparent process would be helpful. And
thank you very much. Mr. Rogers.
On behalf of my customers, I would recommend a hearing on that specific issue.
Great. Mr. Cavaney.
Transparent as possible. We'll be there anytime, any place, and I think you should publish afterwards how the allocation was distributed.
Thank you, Mr. Holliday.
It's critical you get this part right. Whatever process works, we'd like to participate.
Okay, and it would be, obviously, if we had a hearing and it was transparent, that would be helpful to you.
Yes.
Let me just finish, because I have limited time, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Cavaney, for ConocoPhillips, the Section 526 of the 2007 Energy Bill provides a prohibition. Now, I have a great refinery co-located near my congressional district that's really relying on the ability to use sand, oil sand from Canada. Section 526 of the 2000 Energy Bill is a prohibition. What do you think that should be addressed?
May I ask the gentleman to allow it to be submitted for the record so the other witnesses, the other members can get their 4 minutes? Is that possible? I thank the gentleman. I appreciate it. The gentleman from Louisiana is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the opportunity to ask a few questions. Mr. Cavaney, if I could, one of the things that I'm concerned about with the refining section of the bill has to deal with the Mr. LaHood insisted that the bill was not going to harm the refiners. But if we're going to try and hold refiners responsible for consumer emissions, then is it, do I understand that you're going to be able to get 100% of your money back out of the?
No, sir. Using EIA data for, let's say, 2012, and if you use a cost of $25 a ton for carbon, the allocation, our compliance obligation, is going to be $68 billion. The only way we can pass all of that along, 100% along, is under two conditions. We either have inelastic demand or we have elastic supply. Neither one of those conditions exist in the United States refining business. So therefore, zero is not the answer when you talk about an allowance allocation for the oil and gas industry. We also have to cover our own emissions, so we're the only industry that is in both of those buckets. So we are in the process now. We've looked at all the studies. They don't reflect the world going forward. We're doing some work with the committee and others, but some adjustment needs to be made there, and we also ought to address the area called for the energy intensive and the trade exposed, because we also have a lot of opportunities for incoming imports to displace good jobs here in the United States.
Well, that's one of my major concerns right there. So if I'm producing oil and gas in South Louisiana, primarily oil, and I start shutting down refineries because you can't stay in business, then what are we going to do? Ship our oil to foreign refineries and then ship it back, gasoline back into the country?
Well, that depends on whether people want our oil. We may not be able to get our oil sold at a reliable price because other people may want to use different grades. And so we'll be just out in that big bucket of worldwide global supply.
So instead of us just being dependent upon foreign countries for our energy needs in this country, we're going to be dependent upon their energy that they produce, their refiners, and their ability to supply our country and keep our economy going?
It doesn't have to be that way if we design this properly so that the protections are in place and we get to cover our uncoverable costs as we go through this implementation period.
Good. Well, I'd hope that the folks in your industry would work with us. I need to find a way to make sure that the United States gets as close as it can to energy independence as it can in the future, because we're definitely not anywhere as close to that at this point in time.
Yes, sir. We're working with committee.
This to me is important about carbon emissions, but it's even more important to me about economic stability and the power of this country to stay an independent and strong nation. And without our own energy sources, we're going to be in bad shape.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great,
You're back your time.
We appreciate the gentleman yielding back. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Connecticut.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I thank the panel for sticking with us this long. We're all, I think, very proud of the clean new technology companies that we have in our districts, but they unfortunately are, I think, rapidly becoming the exception rather than the rule. We used to lead the world on solar and wind development, and now places like China and Japan are vying for the top spot in photovoltaic production. And so I wanted to ask just one question to the panel, which is that this bill posits that by creating new market mechanisms through an RES and a cap-and-trade system that you're going to have, that you're going to command the kind of private investment in clean new technologies that that we want and need. There's also the route that countries like Korea and China have gone in making major public investments. I think 80% of Korea's stimulus bill was directly invested into these technologies. And so the question is, do you believe that the market mechanisms in this bill really are going to provide real stimulus to that clean energy industry, or are we going to also need a real mix of direct subsidy to try to back up the market mechanisms that we've included here?
Okay. Yeah. Jim and I just came back from a green energy technology conference in California, and the entrepreneurs are alive and well. But what's happening now is they actually have the product that they didn't have 1 or 2 years ago, but the market has dried up, and the market's dried up because people like us aren't ready to invest until we know what the system's going to be. So I actually believe completely that a well-drafted bill will unleash, it'll create the market that will allow that innovation advantage to actually continue in this country.
Any other comments? Let me then ask more specifically. One of the queries and concerns in the last panel was whether we're going to harness that technology in those industries domestically, or whether the market mechanisms in this bill is just going to provide incentive for the production of these technologies somewhere else. Are there other things we can do in this bill to try to incentivize domestic production, or is that going to happen naturally?
I think, speaking from our perspective in DuPont, we do a lot of research. I would study how other countries are incentivizing to make sure that the technology isn't only developed in this country, but commercialized first in this country. I think there's some mechanisms you can put in place, the way you allocate your R&D dollars to the Department of Energy, that could help that greatly.
Great. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, and we thank this very distinguished panel. Your work is the basis for the product that Mr. Waxman and I have put before the members. We will be consulting with you frequently for your expertise as we fill in additional details in the legislation, but you've provided an enormous service to your country, and we thank you so much. And with that, the hearing will stand in recess until 4 o'clock, at which point we will recognize the next panel for their opening statements.